In our last video, we introduced the say-so principle, which is a very effective way to do conflict well so that you can stay out of the triangle and stop making someone your villain and their victim. But did you know that the worst fights that we have in life, that are the most painful, that cut the deepest, and that we tend to have over and over again, there's actually no conflict to resolve in that fight? What is happening there, and why doesn't conflict resolution help? Hi everyone, this is Greg from Heart Tools, where we make it simple to build great relationship. And in the last video, I introduced the say-so principle, which is a very helpful way of resolving conflict. And I said I wanted to follow that up with a video on what do you do if conflict doesn't resolve. And we're going to do that in the next video. But first, I wanted to talk about something that we often mistake for conflict. And we need to understand what's really going on, because if we apply conflict resolution principles to it, we'll actually do a lot of damage. If we misdiagnose the problem, we'll use the wrong tool and it won't be helpful, right? If the job calls for a screwdriver, you don't want to use a chainsaw. So we need to figure out these two separate things so we know which tool to use to be helpful with a situation. Generally, when we think about resolving conflict, it's because someone has done something inappropriate, right? Someone's crossed a boundary, someone broke a promise, someone lied to us, someone gossiped about us. There's been some sort of inappropriate behavior, and we need to have a conversation to point that out and ask the person to start exhibiting a different behavior. But quite often, when we have our worst fights, usually with the people that we love the most and are closest to, and the fights that hurt the most and do the most damage, in a lot of those cases, no one has done anything inappropriate. So to help us understand what's going on in these moments, let me introduce you to Mr. and Mrs. Mugg, who love each other very much. They want to have a great relationship. They're very committed to one another, and they're having a great day until Mrs. Mugg comes up to Mr. Mugg and says something very innocent like, did you take the trash out yet? And for some reason, that statement just bumps Mr. Mugg, and all this anger erupts out of him. And in his mind, he may be thinking something like, can't I just sit down for 5 minutes without being nagged? Or he may be thinking, what are you, my mom, that you're following up with my chores? What is this, right? And so he's very angry, and she's very confused because she was just thinking, hey, maybe I'll take all that meat off the turkey and throw the bones in the trash now, but I don't want to do it if the trash has already gone out, because it'll be there overnight and the dog will get in, right? So she's on her own train of thought, and all of a sudden he's angry and she's very confused. Or it may happen when Mr. and Mrs. Mugg are on a date and having a great time, and Mr. Mugg says something very innocent like, hey, did you see my sister lost 40 pounds? I'm so proud of her. And for some reason, that statement just bumps Mrs. Mugg, and all this shame pours out of her. And she starts thinking things like, I'm not good enough, I'm not pretty enough, I'm never going to lose this weight, you probably don't think I'm attractive, right? And the date just kind of shuts down, and Mr. Mugg is very confused because he's just thinking about all the conversations he had with his sister about her weight and her health and how she didn't feel like herself and all the hard work that she did. And he's just genuinely proud of her. So here's the question. Where does all this emotion come from when no one has done anything inappropriate? Where does all this anger or all this shame come from when no one has done anything wrong, right? It would be one thing if someone lied or someone broke a promise or someone said something sarcastic. But here's what happens. In these moments where no one has done anything appropriate, and yet all this emotion and thought comes out of us, the reason it comes out of us is because it was already in us. All that shame or anger, those feelings like no one respects me, I'm never going to be good enough, that stuff is already in us. And it comes out of us because it was already in us. And we all blame the person that we're with for the stuff that comes out of us, right? All of a sudden now I feel so bad. You must have done something wrong. So we get in a fight. But the reason it came out of us is because it was already in us, and it would come out of us no matter who was with us. At Heart Tools, we call this getting bumped. I've got bumped when someone did something very innocent, and yet for some reason it touches a part of me that brings up my shame or my inadequacy or my frustration with life. And you can tell that someone's gotten bumped because the relational temperature in the room drastically changes, right? Everything's nice and warm, and now all of a sudden someone's really hot. Or everything was nice and warm, and now all of a sudden someone is really cold. And when that happens, someone got bumped. And it can get even crazier because quite often what happens is one person will bump the other person and the other will bump the other person back. For example, let's say one evening Mr. Monk is feeling amorous and he starts flirting with Mrs. Mugg. And as he's flirting, she says something like, "Boy, I'm really tired tonight," right? And that bumps him, and all this, sense of inadequacy comes out, and he starts thinking things like, "I'm not desirable. You never want me. I don't know how to do this sex thing. I'm a failure." And then as he's talking about his frustration with that, then she gets bumped, and all this shame and sense of hopelessness pops out of her, and she starts thinking things like, "I never get this right. I'm just not enough for you. This is always going to go badly." And you have two people bumped who love each other very much, who are very disconnected. And that sets up one of three cycles that tend to be the worst fights that we have with the people that we love the most. The first is Mr. Mugg perhaps starts screaming, right? Because he's feeling all this pain and he doesn't feel connected, and he wants Mrs. Mugg to understand how much he's hurting. So he starts screaming at her, and she's also feeling disconnected in all of her worst stuff, and she needs him to understand how much she's hurting. So she screams back. And then he screams louder and she screams louder, and they both keep screaming, and it just escalates until they both feel crazy. The second kind of cycle happens when one of the two people is a screamer, and that's how they try to reconnect, and the other person hates conflict. It's the worst thing in the world. So they tend to start shutting down and going away. And that becomes a signal to this person that they have to scream louder, right? "I'm trying to get you to pay attention," which scares this person even more, so they shut down even more. And this escalates until one of them is screaming like a maniac, and the other one might be on the bed in a fetal position with blankets over their head, right? And that's extremely painful. The third kind of cycle is when they both hate conflict, and so they both just shut down and go away, and they disconnect for days or weeks until they feel like it's safe to reconnect. And so when we're in one of these three kinds of cycles, and it tends to be the worst fights that we have, the most painful fights, but there's really no conflict involved. So using conflict resolution skills or kind of a theoretical grid isn't going to help you at all. Now we're going to unpack that all when we get to stage 4, because this is stage 4 relationship building skill sets, and we are on stage 1. Now if you're thinking, wait a minute, I need this now, this is exactly where we're at, then I'm going to share a link to 2 different resources that I think are very helpful. The first resource is a book called Created for Connection, and it's a workbook that will help you understand what's happening when you get bumped, what's happening when you get into these cycles, and how you can choose different behaviors to stay connected and to provide healing for one another. The second resource is a couples retreat called The Choreography of Connection, which I think is actually the best thing that couples can do for themselves, is to go through this retreat. It's my single favorite resource available. And in the weekend, you will understand what is happening when you get bumped, what kind of fights that usually leads to, and how to make better choices so that you can stay connected and have the kind of connection that you want in your relationship. So look in the links in the description of this video to find those two tools. The second thing I want to say is, even if you want to do that stage 4 work, and I really recommend you doing that if that's what you need, you still have to learn to do stage 1 well, right? Stage 1 is foundational. All these skills are critical, so you still need to learn how to do this conflict resolution stuff, and how to have hard conversations, and how to respect one another and value one another and be emotionally connected if you want to do stage 4 well. So here's why I'm bringing this up now, even though it's a stage 4 idea and a stage 4 skill set to handle it. It's because if you try to do a say-so with someone when you've gotten bumped, it's not going to work. If you try to do a say-so principle with someone else when they've gotten bumped, it's not going to work. And in our next video, I want to talk about what happens when you try to resolve conflict with someone and the conflict doesn't resolve well. But what I don't want you to do is apply those ideas about what happens when conflict doesn't resolve. Don't apply those to situations where someone has gotten bumped or situations where you've gotten into cycles. So for this video, here's the simple step that I would encourage you to practice. And it's this: when your emotions suddenly change, when the temperature in the room changes relationally, and all of a sudden things are very hot or things are very cold, learn to ask yourself, is this conflict that needs to be resolved, or did I just get bumped and my stuff came up, right? And it's generally easy to tell which it is, because with conflict, there's a universal principle involved. With it's always wrong to lie to someone. It's always wrong to steal. It's always wrong to gossip, to be sarcastic, right? Those things are generally wrong. And if those things happen, there's conflict that needs to be resolved. Getting bumped, it's usually very personal, right? I get bumped because you said, did I take the trash out yet? Or I got bumped because you put the potato chip bag away before I was ready. And all of a sudden I'm really, angry or feeling lots of shame. Something very personal like that. When you learn, like, that's what upset me, there must be something inside of me that's coming out of me. Practice distinguishing between those two things. The other simple step is, if this getting bumped feels very raw to you right now and something that you need to work through, then I would encourage you looking at that book and the couples retreat that I talked about, and I'll put links for those in the description of the video. Simple steps: practice, practice, practice. That's what Heart Tools is all about.